Hi! Do you or any party member you have, are they tired of decks of many things? Staff of the Magi. Oh wait, another Holy Avenger? Well, maybe you need to come on down to Jim and Prue's Low Magic Reserve, where we have almost no magic. Let's talk about it on WebDM. So Jim, let's talk about low magic settings.
Keep it on the DL.
What determines a low magic or a low fantasy setting?
Well, that's kind of the real issue, right? Because there's muddiness and a lot of blurred lines between the definitions here. We've got low fantasy, which sort of like the fantastical elements in your setting are either rare, perhaps non-existent. Something like A Game of Thrones, the first book in A Song of Ice and Fire, describes a low fantasy setting.
Right.
There at one point there were fantastical elements, but most people now they're all grumps and snarkins or whatever the hell Tyrion calls them, snarkins and
grumpkins and snarks.
Grumpkins and snarks.
Yeah.
But by the end of it, obviously that begins to change.
Yeah,
and
dragons are boring.
Right. That's one sort of end of this spectrum. The other is sort of low magic. The elements of a typical Dungeons and Dragons setting are in place. It's just they're less prevalent. So there's less wizards, there's fewer spellcasters, fewer monsters.
Yeah.
But otherwise the design conceits and sort of setting conventions in a typical D&D world are still present.
Yeah, they're all there.
Right.
It's just like, oh, don't go into that forest because there's the one hag that lives over in this entire region.
Because spellcasting is relatively uncommon, it tends to be viewed with suspicion, things like that.
Yeah.
There's a variant of that which is described in the Dungeon Master's Guide called just Sword and Sorcery, in which the fantastical elements of it are somehow sinister. In Sword and Sorcery games, the heroic party members are more like barbarians and fighters and rogues who don't really rely on magic because magic users are sinister, or in order to practice magic they have to engage in sort of despicable acts. That's kind of the Sword and Sorcery. They mentioned Dark Sun as being the archetypal Sword and Sorcery setting for Dungeons and Dragons. For the purposes of our show, we're kind of talking about all of them at once. Just sort of a feel of fantasy that magic is more rare.
Yeah.
Spellcasting is more rare. Monsters and fantastical elements are more rare. And it's a bit more down to earth, but it's not necessarily Sword and Sorcery.
Where on that spectrum do you prefer to play your low magic or low fantasy setting? What do you prefer?
Longtime viewers know that we really cut our teeth on 3rd edition. Like we started on 2nd edition in Dungeons and Dragons, played that for a bit, but 3rd edition it was sort of the height of our gaming in a lot of ways.
Yes.
And so I remember being really into it, and towards the tail end of 3rd edition, reading an article on the Alexandrian about recalibrating your expectations for Dungeons and Dragons. And it was sort of this really in-depth analysis at the first 5 levels of 3rd edition, and looking like, okay, here are Olympic athletes. Here's what they can do. Here's what a dedicated physical character who's 4th or 5th level can do. They are on par with an Olympic athlete.
Right.
Here's what a blacksmith can do. Here's what an equivalent 3rd or 4th level character, an expert assisted by apprentices with all of their skill points and feats sunk into these things. They can hit DCs in the high 20s. It was just sort of a way of making me go like, yeah, I guess you don't have to have super high level characters to have very competent characters. And this is all in the context of 3rd edition. And I think the examples that the Alexandrian Justin Alexander gives is like Aragorn is a low-level ranger, right?
Yeah.
He's not like a high-level ranger. He's not like a 20th level ranger.
He's like 5th.
Like fifth level. I took it seriously. I was like, okay, I will recalibrate my expectations. The fact that a 5th level wizard can wander into a village and his power level, that wizard's power level, what they can do is so far outside of anything that anyone else in that village can do that's real power, even though it's relatively low level compared to 20th level.
Right. Looking at 1st through 20, you get to 5, you're like, okay, well, I'm a quarter of the way where I want to be.
Right.
But like you said, compared to villagers, I mean, they're running around with what, 4 hit points, 5 hit points
at
each.
Best, sure. Yeah.
He drops one fireball on the village, and that's it.
And that's
one
it.
guy.
And it burns down the whole thing. And so I think it's similarly with like a cleric. A 5th level cleric visits a village, and that's a miraculous event. They might erect a shrine to either that cleric or the god that cleric is representing,
or run him out of town.
Or run him out of town, depending on the type of cleric and what they get up to. It really was influential on me. And of course, outside of that grew E6, Epic 6 gaming, which is where you stop leveling up at level 6. You get feats afterwards. Every 5,000 XP, you still get another feat. Of course, 3rd edition, there are metric crapload of feats that you to choose from, and so you could do that. But the idea was that you stopped gaining hit points and attack bonuses and spell slots and everything at 6th level, because 6th level was epic enough.
Yeah.
And I think that really had a profound impact on how I view Dungeons and Dragons and how I create a world. When I think of like low fantasy and low magic, it is also low level Dungeons and Dragons. It doesn't have to be, but I tend to think of it as low level Dungeons and Dragons. Now you take something like Adventures in Middle Earth, which is the setting from I believe Cubicle 7, that they sort of like apply their One Ring RPG, turn it into a 5th edition game, and basically recreated a lot of the classes, offering non-magic versions of Bard,
the Ranger,
more non-magic versions of the Ranger, and even kind of like a wizard substitute or a druid maybe, where they're kind of like a lore master and are good with animals and beasts and lore, particularly lore of the enemy and orcs and the shadow and things like that. But they're not a spellcaster necessarily.
Right.
That is a good example of this is low magic and could be used in a low fantasy campaign, but those are classes that go up to 20th level. Right. They would still be 20th level Dungeons and Dragons classes, right? Capable of all the crazy shit that
you're still gonna be a badass.
Can get to. Right. That's maybe where I would start, is something like Adventures in Middle Earth. I know that there is a fan made. It's called Low Fantasy Gaming for 5th edition. It's like a 180-page PDF that we'll track down the link for. That also sort of does something similar, where they tone down the magic within 5th edition in order to produce a certain type of game that's more down to earth, more evocative of the low fantasy setting that they're trying to go for. Probably one of those two would be where I start in a mechanical sense for creating a low fantasy game.
Right. So you're gonna close down the Walgreens, CVS corner stores of magic that you normally have in, say, Forgotten Realms or whatever. But what does that look like for a spellcaster? Is it just a thing where you make spells less prevalent, or is it a thing where you actually have to quest for spell components?
I think that there's a lot of different ways to handle it. You could just put a hard cap. You could just say like, oh, right, no spells after X level. You're not learning them on your own. You don't have access to them. Maybe if you want them, you have to find someone who can teach you, find like an extraplanar entity or something that's capable of that, or finding a magic item that recreates the effect. That's kind of a heavy-handed way of doing it, but it is kind of a one way. The other way is to just do an exhaustive overhaul of the spells and look at them and go, okay, which one of them, first off, which one of them have material components, and get rid of things like Arcane Focus and Spell Component Bag, because those are two items that, while they speed up play and they're very convenient, no one likes tracking spell components. It's worth it in a low fantasy game to go, no, you do have to track those spell components. You do have to keep track of those things. That magic is rare, and this is one of the reasons why it's rare. Because it requires these exotic materials that you might not always have access to in order to gain that power.
Yeah, I mean, I've always thought of the spell component pouch or Arcane Focus. It's like a cheat code that they made like a normal feature of the game.
Right.
Like, you know what? Let's just do that so we don't have to worry about all of this gathering.
Right.
Yeah.
In
Skyrim, if you don't want to run around and pick up all the flowers and stuff, you don't have to, right?
Well, it's like we mentioned in our episode on limitations, and sort of like the fact that boundaries and limitations and can be fun. They can add to the fun of the game. They can make for a richer, more engaging game. This is one of those areas where I think it could be. And telling someone, all right, you want to play a spellcaster, you want to play a full spellcaster in this game world that I've just described. There are no full spellcasters, or they're ultra rare. But you're going to let them play it, then you're like, yeah, you will have to jump through these extra hoops. You're not going to be a superhero flying around over here. You have got to work for your magic. You have got to research the spells. It doesn't just happen automatically. Maybe that's another way to reinforce it. Wizards, in the specific case, wizards don't get automatic spells when they level up. They have to go find other people to teach them this magic.
Right, and trying to find those are going to be an adventure of themselves.
Right, and that kind of gives an extra incentive to, say, maybe play a sorcerer who gains that innately, and maybe the sorcerer only picks things with, without material components. Or subtle spell becomes an important part of that sorcerer's character, and then now you have a context for that, right? That subtle spell using sorcerer's caster.
Well, subtle spell only. I only say this because I've been playing one recently. Subtle spell is only for verbal and somatic.
Right. So you still have to have the material
components.
You still have to have those objects and items of magical significance. So I think that's sort of one way, and particularly when dealing with spellcasters, that you can kind of limit things.
I mean, or it becomes a thing where it's like, oh, you found this spell, and it's an amazing spell, right? And you look down, and the component's like, oh, you need the ground up horn of a gorgon.
Right. Now you got to go find a gorgon.
Good luck with that.
Right.
You know, like, make that part of it. Like, oh yeah, I have this spell. Can you cast it yet? Nope. What do we got to do? See that thing over there? We have to kill it.
We got to kill it, and then we got to take the horns off of it. So I think that there are a number of other elements to low fantasy games that sort of serve as a touchstone, and you can kind of use them and adjust these elements to create the kind of low fantasy game you'd want. Number one is like, how many spellcasters are there? In the typical sort of Dungeons and Dragons world, every big city has a collection of spellcasters. Maybe even a small village has one or two, or there's someone in the region who has it. But this might be a case of like, the monarch has a spellcaster that they employ, who knows maybe third level magic, probably more like second level magic, that they can reliably cast. And it's like a whole church has an organization, and maybe there's 2 or 3 people in it capable of performing miracles.
Yeah, the Pope can cast third level spells.
Only when they are sitting on their throne, full regalia, in the high temple, surrounded
by worshipers who are chanting the chants.
That's the kind of conditions that you put it under, and it's not just something that they can sling spells wherever. Maybe saying like, okay, everything after 7th level magic, which is really game-changing magic for a lower world, just doesn't exist, and 6 is our hard cap on magic. You kind of adjust the spellcasting classes. Maybe there are no full spellcasters, and everyone is a quarter or a half caster in some capacity. But moving beyond spells and magic and things like that, you might say that like monsters become utterly unique. There's not red dragons. There is a red dragon.
Yeah.
And no one has seen it in centuries, but it's rumored to live in that smoking mountain over there, and no one in their right mind would go figure it out, because occasionally that mountain belches out fire and smoke, and why in the world would you do that?
Yeah, because the dragon's having a nightmare, you know.
Right, there is a green dragon somewhere in these woods. Making monsters unique, number one, that's a great gift to the dungeon master. There's something about making monsters unique and saying, this is the only one like it. This is the only chimera. This is the only manticore. This is the only purple worm. And just going through the monster manual and going, okay, these are the monsters that are utterly unique. Now you've given the dungeon master an opportunity to create these sort of rich, elaborate backstories to their monsters. They can seed that information into the world, and the characters can then kind of come to understand and come to read legends, hear stories, uncover clues about this one particular type of monster. And when they fight it, it's a more memorable encounter because they know this is the only time that they will encounter this thing. And that also does raise, that might raise a unique dilemma for some PCs. We're like, well, should we kill this monster that is utterly unique in the world?
Yeah.
And
what did it really do?
Right.
Like, if it is just the only red dragon, but hasn't attacked anybody, but rumor is that it, laid waste to the kingdom 1,000 years ago.
Right.
What gives you the right?
Right.
To go in and just kill it?
And particularly for the more animalistic monsters that are acting more on instinct or, not out of malice or anything like that, having the opportunity to say, this is the only one that anyone knows about. Is a good way. And then you can kind of interject that. What if you found a dragon egg in that setting? What would you do? What if you found a monster, a baby monster, and attempted to raise or something? Making your monsters unique, making them rare is going to be a way to reinforce the kind of low fantasy in it.
Yeah, and also it lends the DM an opportunity to quote Sean Connery when they go and fight the dragon. I am the last one. And maybe his last attack was because a party of adventurers came 1,000 years ago to try to kill him, and he's like, well, I'm going to go lay waste to your village now.
Right.
And he just wants to hang out.
And not just dragons. I mean, they were talking about like the extraplanar creatures. Maybe it is incredibly difficult to bring in extraplanar creatures into this world. So what does that cut out? That cuts out everything that lives in the Feywild and the Shadowfell and the outer planes and the inner planes. That's outsiders and elementals and Fey and celestials and fiends and like whole host of monsters that become either non-existent in the world, merely legend,
Right.
or are
The children of the forest.
right, the children of the forest, or you just say, I'm not going to use these monsters. And the same with goes for like aberrations, lithids and beholders and things like that. It's like those are fairly high fantasy concepts and ideas.
Yeah.
Now I can see a low fantasy world in which there are only aberrations, and you get rid of every other type of monster, and it's just a world with Grell and brain eaters and lithids and things like that.
Dude.
That humanity and the other races are sort of desperately fighting off without the aid of magic. Right.
Let me tell you, that sounds fun right there. I would play in that.
That's more of if you're trying to channel the Carcosa vibe of old school setting. So
Yeah, that's some Lovecraftian shit.
right, manipulating the monsters and sort of like what you do with them is going to be important.
So what is the distribution of magic items look like?
I mean, magic items might be utterly rare, and a +1 sword might be a legendary artifact that is, fabled and either long lost or carefully guarded, and only selectively chosen out.
Yeah, kind of like Valyrian steel swords.
Right, kind of like Valyrian steel swords, or or the magic swords that come from our own mythology and legend, where they are either items imbued with significance because of the deeds performed by them,
yes,
or just sort of the personalities of the people that wielded them, imbue them with significance. I think that magic items are going to have to be rare, and there might be some that you just say, not having. Nothing that grants flight. Like flight is one of those things where you've crossed over from low fantasy into sort of like high fantasy realms. That's in my mind.
Yeah. Well, at least with regards to altitude.
Certainly.
But like you were saying, like the deeds imbued, like what, I mean, because the thing is like in our own mythology, like Excalibur, right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that could have just been a +1 sword. Hell, it could have been just a magic sword. Doesn't have a bonus, doesn't have any effect. It is a magic sword. It affects things.
If I remember correctly, it's the scabbard of Excalibur that's the real badass one. Where it's like you don't bleed, you can't die as long as you're wearing it, that kind of thing.
Scabbard of wound closure.
Right. Maybe you just say, there are no artifacts or legendary items, and we're going to cap it at very rare. And like, not only are we capping it at very rare, but all of the ones that are very rare are unique. This is the only one in existence. You're not going to find multiples of this particular magic item, and it's only the stuff that when you get down to common, you might treat those common as if they're rare. Maybe just kind of bump everything up in category. You can't go into a town and buy potions of healing.
Right.
You can't go into a town and purchase or acquire scrolls to gain more magic items. Those are rare items that only a handful of individuals in the world can create. Yeah. And so a healing potion then becomes a precious treasured resource that you hang on to.
Yeah, you truly want to save that for a life or death situation.
A life or death situation.
As opposed to, well, this is our second combat. We might have one more. I'll go ahead and chug this healing potion. Like, no. You want to retreat, rest, come back later.
Save that healing potion for when someone's failed 2 death saving throws and they're
bleeding out.
They're bleeding out. Yeah. Sort of in terms of magic items and other things, there's a lot of different variant rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide that you might want to consider. The gritty realism healing that sort of like 8 hours is a short rest, 1 week between long rests. That's one way.
Yeah.
There are other ways in which sort of like how healing works, how often you can spend hit die, how often you can use a healer's kit. Those might reinforce the kind of deadliness that you might want. Although I would also say like low level D&D in 5th edition is still pretty deadly, like up until 3rd level. So you might want to be careful with that.
Yeah, it is pretty deadly. Now, if you were to do that with expanding what a short and a long rest is, would you do that with magic also? Would you make it where you get your spells back on a long rest, but guess what? You got to spend a week.
Yeah,
relearning
there's
spells.
A week between those long rests. Yeah, I would. Yeah, that's just sort of going to reinforce the rarity of magic, and that means that the player characters, even if they do have magic at their disposal, they're not relying on it as often.
Yeah.
I in my experience, both as a player and DM in 5th edition, magic often becomes a crutch.
Yes.
And players then start saying like, well, we have no slots left.
We gotta rest.
We gotta rest. And it's just like, wait a second, your character has 6 stats. And you have your imagination, right? Anything you can think of, you can attempt. And the DM should work with you to create reasonable difficulty classes that you have to then overcome, or reasonable challenges. But you see it a lot where people are like, well, we've got no slots left. We got to rest. And that, I think the mentality of that comes from, number one, there's so many classes that have access to magic, and spell slots are just another type of resource that you use. But when everyone has magic, or the majority of the party members have magic, and they're using it in every situation, situation, and that spells are always applied to the task at hand, then you do get into a case where it's just like, without the magic that we have, we can't do anything.
Yeah.
And that's really where, right, that's really one of those moments where if you find yourself, you're in a group like that, you might want to try a low fantasy campaign where magic isn't that prevalent and is much more rare, because it will force you to go, yeah, I don't need magic to do these things. I don't need magic to sneak into the castle. I don't need magic to fight off this large battle. Obviously, if you're playing barbarians and rogues and spellless ranger that you found somewhere, or a monk or something like that, you'll make up for that in some way. Mm-hmm. But I think it's worthwhile if you're kind of like tired of standard fantasy D&D with magic everywhere. Yeah. And I don't know, that's just an option that you have to kind of break out of that cycle. Yeah. Of thinking about magic.
And I mean, the thing is once you have once you've recalibrated all those other options, you can still just play the same game. You still have the same adventures. Whatever's harassing the town, you got to go out and you got to find them. But, they're being run by this guy, and you go find him, and that's the big bad in the mountain. I mean, it's all the same.
Thinking about how you want the distribution of the various fantasy races is another way. A lot of low fantasy literature and sources of inspiration is very human-centric. Mm-hmm. Elves and dwarves and halflings and gnomes and goblins and orcs and all that sort of exists on the fringes. Maybe the reason why elves are monoculture is because there's just the one kingdom left.
Yeah.
Or they've disappeared entirely. Maybe the dwarves they locked themselves up in their mountain, and they're up there, we guess. No one's seen from them in 5 or 6 generations.
Yeah.
But they say they're still up there, that kind of thing. Or there were goblins in that forest, and occasionally people do go missing when they go off the beaten trail, but no one's seen a goblin.
And no one goes off the trail. Why would you?
Why would you go off the trail? It's the forest. There are bears and wolves out there as well. Constructing a world in which the fantastical elements are rare, that highlights them. And then when you use them in a campaign, when you bring them out, particularly if you have player buy-in and everybody's into their characters and they've accepted the fact that this is a low fantasy world where the fantastical elements are less prevalent, when you then reintroduce them, it lends them more weight, and players take them maybe a bit differently than they would like, it's just another goblin, or it's just another orc, something like that.
Just another orc.
Just another orc.
Orc would rip your fucking head off.
Damn right.
Anyway.